Today, I want to talk about why Candace Stone really returned to confront Joe and what her recurring presence signals in the overarching story. While Joe ran from her, writing her off as an insane woman merely out for revenge as she follows him to LA, and Love dismisses her as crazy, Candace's experience with Joe and the timing and motive of her return reveal something deeper about Joe and his journey through season 2 that's later echoed in season 5. Spoilers for season 5. In the final moments of the first season, as he's ready to move on with his life, having finished the book of Beck, Joe starts eyeing a new woman as she walks into the bookstore, ready to start the deadly process all over, when he's faced with his past comeback to haunt him and Candace, his first girlfriend, essentially returning from the dead. Candace's character is the embodiment and lingering loose end of Joe's past and his pattern of obsession and violence demanding to be reckoned with. Candace and Joe first dated prior to season 1, with Joe likely drawn to her for her band name Heathcliff's Misery, referencing Candace's own favorite book Wuthering Heights, allowing Joe to cast her as the cool rocker chick falling for the cozy quiet bookkeep. But once she gets bored with his boring book life, Candace cheats on Joe with the music producer that she's been working with. Joe targets Elijah and pushes him off of a building when he characterizes Candace as a bitch, but their troubles don't blow over as Candace still doesn't want to be in a relationship with Joe. When she tries to leave him, ending their story on her terms and literally tearing the pages out of the book that he's given her, he attacks her in the street and abducts her to the woods. Candace pleads to go back home as if she could just play along and forget the whole thing ever happened, but Joe insists on partaking in the picnic that he packed. She runs at the first chance she gets and he chases her, tackling her to the ground and burying what he believes to be her dead body. In reality, Candace survives and escaped being buried alive, only to be turned away by the police who insist that they can't do anything to help her without clear evidence, as being still covered in dirt from the grave she escaped just isn't proof enough. Advised by the female officer to leave town and let her attacker continue believing that she's dead, Candace starts over as a new girl in a new city. Joe carries on with his own life, moping around for a few months waiting for his next muse, until he meets her and just months later murders her too. Because Joe is so brazen to publish his rewrite of Beck's story and so basic that it's instantly recognizable as a Joe Goldberg romance fantasy, Candace clocks that Joe's done it again when she stumbles across Beck's book. She returns to Mooney's to confront him as he's storyboarding his next fantasy, calling out his guilt in Beck's death and teasing that she wants to kill him with her bare hands. Candace explains that turning Joe into the police wouldn't be enough because he'd be going to jail as his delusional version of himself, a good guy who never meant to hurt anybody, so she plans to show him who he really is, ironically driving him away to LA where he meets Love, a woman who does show Joe who he really is through her own actions, with Love doing to Joe a version of what Joe did to Beck. Joe escapes his past to pit stop in LA, the worst city in the world, and walks around paranoid that he could be followed by Candace, an overlooked insight into the fear that women like Candace and Marianne live with when the abuser that they escaped faces no punishment. Joe can't help himself as he starts fresh to author his story with Love, going harder on the unreliable narrator than usual as he spends the first episode explaining how temporarily he plans to stay in LA while positioning himself to fall for Love and play protector to Ellie. Being his own undoing, seeing himself in Henderson and demanding the type of confession from him that Joe refuses to give himself for Candace, Joe targets Henderson under the guise of protecting Ellie to excuse his violence, invading the privacy of a random girl child in order to be worthy of love. But this venture is what exposes Joe to Candace, who manages to track him down from a video taken of 40 the night that they went to Henderson's house. On the surface, Joe blames 40 who's causing a scene as he's, interestingly, desperate to pitch a new story but hits a dead end with Henderson's assistant. But Joe's real reason for being here is because he's on a recon mission, desperate to pitch a new story, but hitting a dead end not finding Henderson's jacktop. Well, it was a dead end for Joe, but Candace happened upon the video and managed to meet up with 40 to get an in with the Quinns. She returns to LA with him right after Henderson's murder, as Joe has enacted his violent authorship to end another story. As Candace hangs around as Amy Adams, she introduces 40 and Love to Beck's book, The Dark Face of Love, which 40 has fixated on and decided to pursue as his next screenplay. She knows she can't outright convince the Quinns of her story, so she gives them the pieces to see the real Joe on their own. She does the same for Delilah on the day that she shows up to Joe's apartment and convinces her to check inside for some earrings that she supposedly left as a cover to unlock a window to return and snoop around later. Love catches Candace sneaking into Joe's apartment after having her family's PI look into her when she let her character slip at the weekend. Candace tries to warn Love that Joe is dangerous, especially to her as his intimate partner, but Love dismisses Candace as crazy and and pays her off to send her away after learning the truth of Joe's real name and their history together. With Candace gone, Love turns her PI on Joe and breaks into his storage unit to see for herself what he's been hiding. And then she starts up a fake fling with Milo to lure out the real Joe. Delilah beats her to it, hooking up with Joe while he's figuring out next steps, and then revisiting his apartment to snoop around once Officer Finch tips her off to Joe's Henderson headphone weirdness. She finds his key to the storage unit with the cage and all of his relocated evidence, and Joe traps her in, insisting that it will only be for a short time, just like his stay in LA, until he's safely out of the country, and then he leaves a goodbye note for Love that conveniently leads them to reconcile, requiring Joe to rush back to the cage. As Joe returns before Delilah is released, to stop her from being freed, he narrates that he is heading there to let her go. This is simply a lie, and the crux of Joe's story with Candace. When she recounts how he attacked her, he says that's not how any of it happened. But it is. He just lies about what he does as he does it. So he says he's rushing back to let Delilah go, but letting Delilah go requires no action. If Joe wanted to let Delilah go, he could simply let it happen, but he returns because he cannot let it happen, and as Joe mutters to Delilah's dead body that he told her he'd let her walk out of there, but he failed her, Candace shows up to the storage unit and traps him in the cage. Before she calls the police, she calls Love to show her who Joe really is, feeling scorned by her previous dismissal and wanting to vindicate herself from Joe poisoning the Quinns against her. But Love has already come to see Joe in the only way that she will, and she knows that he didn't kill Delilah, so she feels sick and runs out after he admits to doing it. As Candace tries to confront Love, believing she's upset by the revelation of Joe's murderous ways and not the exposure of her own, Love grabs a broken bottle out of the trash and kills Candace, refusing to let Joe's past and the honest reality of who he is interfere with the story of the two of them as soulmates, starting the perfect family that she's always wanted. Love returns to Joe, showing him who he really is and positioning him to experience himself in the same way that Beck did. But he still mentally differentiates himself from Love and draws from Beck's playbook to trick his way out of the cage with his own Joe spin as he nearly kills Love. But she reveals that she's pregnant, and the potential narrative of Joe protecting a baby girl and all of the violence and control that could entail is just too enticing for him to pass up. So he gives that a shot, sticking it out in suburbia for a year or two before heading off on a mental breakdown holiday in London, where Joe does contend once again with having to face himself. And again, through a woman who embraces him despite his past but this time shares a desire to live the narrative of being a good person, Joe finds a way to be reborn as himself and conveniently be cleansed of everything he's done before. Until season 5, when a red-headed woman who read Beck's book and caught on to Joe as her murderer comes after him with the intention of showing him who he really is. Wow, that sounds really familiar. I feel that Candace is invoked in Bronte's red hair and her initial mission, with her catching Joe's edits in Beck's book and planning to walk Joe through a series of scenes leading to an eventual confrontation where they lay bare all of the evidence of his crimes. Louise as a character uses Joe's own tactics against him, reminiscent of Candace's comment of learning from Joe that it's easy to hunt somebody if you really want to, and how she herself starts to become fixated on protecting people that she has no responsibility to protect. Candace's heart-shaped glasses also make a reappearance in the promo posters, this time with rose-colored lenses, alluding to Bronte's original Candace-inspired mission being overwritten by the rosy romantic narrative that Joe starts dictating. And finally, while I took the message "Secrets Do Not Stay Buried" literally to jokingly theorize that Candace would return simply so I could say Candace is alive 2025, it turns out I was kind of right. Candace was alive in Bronte, who followed through on her pursuit to force Joe to face who he really is and expose him to the world before being locked away forever.